I've got a few messages coming through, so just give me a couple of minutes. Okay, so Fiskama Ula, good evening everyone. Fáilte chuna hiad áirit Roine Akins. Welcome to the first of this series of online talks. I'm Shona McClellan and I'm the Dualchas Namara, or the Maritime Heritage Officer at a project for the project at Museum nan Eilean. So before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. The first is, please can you all remain muted during the talk. This will reduce feedback. The second is also to turn your cameras off. This is to ensure that the connection can be uninterrupted, because sometimes that can reduce the connection. Tonight's talk is also being live streamed onto our YouTube channel, and it is going to be recorded and it will be made available for anyone else to watch after this. So when you are unmuted, please do not swear, or we also won't tolerate anything inappropriate behaviour. So tonight's talk is on Hebrideans and the Viking Sagas. And our speaker, Dr. Jennings, is a lecturer with the University of the Highlands and Islands and is also the programme leader for a number of subjects for the Institute of Northern Studies based in Shetland, including Viking studies. So once Andrew has finished his presentation, we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session. You can ask a question via the chat function, which is probably the best way because I'll probably be able to see that better than the raise your hand function on Microsoft Teams. So I will now let Andrew tell you more about the Hebrideans in the Viking Sagas. So Andrew, if you want to start.
Thank you very much, Shona. Hello everyone, I'll just check this and get my PowerPoint working. Hold on just a second. Should be this one. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that, Shona? Let me know. Yes, no? Okay, that should be working. But just okay. It's saying it's sharing, but we can keep going without that. So yes, hello. I'm someone else has started sharing. That's what's happened. Okay, let's try that again. Anna is sharing something. Let's just okay. Try again. Here we go.
Right.
Is that it?
I think you have to request. Why is it not late?
Share content. There we go. And we just press that.
Hopefully.
No files available, it says.
It says Anna is sharing. So maybe if I pin you, Andrew, it might help.
Okay. So if Anna could stop sharing her screen, please, that would be a good start.
I'll try and...
Right. Well, I'll continue, and if you can sort that, that'd be great. Yeah. But the talk, in fact, doesn't really need illustration. It's just to stop people falling asleep, just sort of staring at my face for 45 minutes or so. So I'm very pleased to be able to
Try it now. Sorry guys, don't know.
There we go again. How's that? Right. The gremlins are with us tonight.
Yes.
So I won't share it. No, I will. I'll try this sharing just once more. Let's see what happens. Okay, here we go.
That's working.
That's working. There we go. Okay, great stuff. Right, well, we'll keep going just to make sure now we're on the right side of whichever gods are watching us tonight. As Shona said, I am the programme leader of the MLIT in Viking Studies, and I have a particular interest in the Viking impact on the Hebrides, and Vikings in the Isles was the focus of my PhD many moons ago now. And this evening, I want to talk about Hebrideans in the Icelandic sagas. They turn up quite often and have quite a distinctive collection of characteristics. The sagas include references to people who went from the Hebrides to settle in Iceland. Famous people like the impressive Auður the Deep-Minded, who was the daughter of Ketill Flatnose, the ruler of the Hebrides at some point in the 9th century, and who went on to become one of the most important Icelandic settlers. I gave a talk about Auður recently at the opening of Meg Rogers' exhibition at Tækjarsavag. Meg was displaying a beautiful Varafelder cloak made from wool from Norway, Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, the Faroes, and Iceland, signifying Auður's travels across the North Atlantic. I also talked about her on the recently broadcast TV programme Tasglann, or The Far Traveller. Auður is clearly a very popular figure at the moment. Auður herself had been influenced by Christianity while in the Hebrides, and Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, claimed she raised crosses at Cross Hills in Iceland, and she used to say her prayers there. This is really interesting, as there's evidence for the survival of Christianity in the Hebrides during the Viking period, and for the early Christianization of the Viking settlers. For example, although there were periods when the great monastery of Iona, founded by St. Columba, was severely affected by Viking raids, it seems the monastery kept on going through the worst of it. And by 980, the Norse king of Dublin, called Olaf, was inspired to come to Iona to die. Auður's cousin Urligur Hrafnsson was supposed to have founded a church at Esjuberg near Reykjavik, dedicated to St. Columba, or Columkilla, as they have it in Icelandic, straight from the Gaelic. And her brother-in-law, Helgi the Lean, according again to Landnámabók, believed in Christ, but invoked Thor when it came to sea voyages and when things got difficult. Later Icelanders were very pleased to be descended from Auður. However, I'm not sure we can actually regard Auður as a Hebridean. If she existed, she was probably born in Norway. Her father, Ketill, was supposed to have come from either Romsdal or Sogn in western Norway, but she certainly spent some formative years in the Isles. On the other hand, the composer of the late 10th century poem Hafgerðinga Draupa, the Sea Hedges poem, was clearly a Hebridean and a Christian as well. He's described as a Suðureyskur maður, a Hebridean man, and he composed the poem while sailing on Herjolf Barðarsson's ship to Greenland. Herjolf was accompanying Eric the Red to set up the first Norse settlement in Greenland. Unfortunately, only fragments of the poem survive, but he calls upon God to watch out for him at sea. And here we have one little fragment that survives. I beseech the Immaculate Master of Monks to steer my journeys. May the Lord of the lofty heavens hold his strong hand over me. Hafgerðingar seemed to be some kind of massive wave which would be encountered near the coasts of Greenland. And presumably his prayer worked, because Herjolf made it to Greenland and his son Bjarni was the first European to see Greenland. He saw it at a distance. The Hebridean poet presumably settled down in Herjolf's farm on Herjolf's Ness. The unnamed poet who gave us Hafgerðinga Draupa was not the only Hebridean to make it to Greenland. According to Erik the Red saga, just before the year 1000, Leif Erikson, while sailing from Greenland to Norway, was blown off course to the Hebrides, where he had an adventure with a local noblewoman called Thorgunna. And this is the bit from the saga. When Leif sailed from Greenland that summer, the ship was driven off course to land in the Hebrides. And from there, they failed to get a favourable wind and had to stay in the islands for much of the summer. Leif fell in love with a woman called Thorgunna. She was a very good family, and Leif realised that she knew a thing or two. When Leif was leaving Thorgunna, she asked to go with him. Leif asked whether her kinsmen were of any mind to agree to this, and she declared she didn't care. Leif said he was reluctant to abduct a woman of such high birth from a foreign country. There are so few of us, he said. Thorgunna spoke. I'm not sure you'll like the alternative better. I'll take my chances on that, said Leif. Then I'll tell you, Thorgunna said, that I am with child, and this child is yours. It's my guess that I will give birth to a boy in due course. And even though you ignore him, I will raise the boy and send him to you in Greenland as soon as he is of age to travel with others. But it's my guess that he will serve you as well as you have served me now with your departure. I intend to come to Greenland myself before it's all over. Leif gave her a golden ring, a Greenland cape, and a belt of ivory. The boy, who was named Thorgils, did come to Greenland, and Leif recognized him as his son. Some men say that this Thorgils came to Iceland before the hauntings at Froðá in the summer, which we'll come to shortly. Thorgils stayed in Greenland after that, and before it was all over, he was also thought to have something strange about him. Now, I'm sure Thorgunna would have been pleased with her gifts, particularly the belt made of walrus ivory. This was a priceless item. Current research suggests that the search for walrus ivory may have been one of the main reasons behind the Norse movement west. The reason they went to Iceland and to Greenland was to pursue the walrus. Thorgunna herself probably made it to Iceland in pursuit of Leif, of which more shortly. And if you like modern Viking stories, Thorgils is the main character in a series of novels by Tim Severin. The first volume is called Odin's Child. And then I think it's a trilogy, so well worth getting hold of. As far as the Norse Greenlanders were concerned, there was something odd or weird about Thorgils. And this was only to be expected because he was a stereotypical Hebridean. The Hebridean stereotype in Icelandic literary tradition really does conform to the Byronic description of mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Although Hebrideans are always portrayed speaking Norse in the sagas, we'll discover that they're clearly other. And being other, as in inverted commas, they are disruptive to the social order and therefore highly dangerous. In fact, I'll suggest that in a sense, they represent death, or at the very least, death seems to follow them around. Now, I'm not going to claim that I'm doing something entirely new in pointing out that Hebrideans tend to be portrayed in a stereotypical manner in the sagas. It's been noticed by previous scholars. For example, Aubrey Hamilton MacLeod, the one-time British ambassador to Iceland, wrote an enjoyable paper for Northern Studies on the subject, and he made this point: "The Hebrideans who figure in Norse literature make no good showing. They are invariably associated with witchcraft, magic, and evil spirits." And what I'm going to do is bring the material together and show you just how right he was. Now, there's a fine little book called The Vikings in Lewis, which you may well know, edited by Shorn and Quinn, which notes Hebridean strangeness. And there's an excellent section devoted to magic, where it notes that Hebrideans were great practitioners of magic. And the section also includes a detailed account of the story from Laxdæla saga about the Hebridean sorcerers, the save men, called Cotkill, his wife Grima, and their frightening sons. They're described in the Laxdæla saga as mjög fjölkunnig, which means very skilled in magic. And their presence in Laxdæla, move that back a bit. It was very unwelcome because they were seriously dodgy characters. Cotkill's family indulged in a malevolent seidr, or magic performance. Seidr, for those who would like to know more about Norse magic, was the dubious, unmanly type of magic that women and the god Odin indulged in. It was probably something like shamanism, where a magician is penetrated by a spirit. And the performance involved the setting up of a save-hjallur, or a magic platform, from which, chanting incantations, they raised a storm which drowned a certain Thorður Ingunnarsson and his companions. And on another occasion, they climbed onto the roof of Hrútur Herjolfsson's house and began chanting incantations. Attracted by the chanting, Hrútur's favourite son, the 12-year-old Kári, stepped outside, walked into the spells, as it describes it, and promptly fell down dead. You have to be careful not to walk into spells. And because of their evil deeds, the family were hunted down and stoned to death. Apart, that is, from Kotkill's son Stigandi, who made his escape and became an outlaw, and according to the saga, caused a great deal of trouble. Eventually, he was also captured, and a bag was put over his head to stop him using the evil eye. However, as it says, there was a tear in the bag, and Stigandi could glimpse the hillside on the opposite side of the valley. It was a fine stretch of land, rich with grass, but suddenly it was as if a whirlwind came and turned the whole sward upside down, so that no grass has ever grown there since. And the place is called Brenna, which means burnt place. Now, Stigandi's eye brought death, and the similarity with the Irish figure Balor, king of the Fomóira, is striking. The Fomóira, or Fomorians, were the monstrous demonic enemies of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the old Gaelic gods. And Balor was a malevolent cyclops. His gaze also brought fire and destruction. It's probably just coincidence, but some Irish sources place the Fomóira in the Hebrides. Stigandi's brother Hallbjorn also seems to have had the evil eye, because he's given this odd nickname, Sleekisteinsauga, Sleekstone Eye. And in fact, a bag was also put over his head to sort of counteract the effect. Hallbjorn continued to be a nuisance after his death, a feat attributed to several Hebrideans, as we'll see. After death, he became a zombie, which grappled with a certain Thorkell before sinking into the ground. I think it's more than just coincidence that Hebrideans are connected to a story which is strikingly similar to Old Irish legendary material. There's a Gaelic connection here that just needs unpicked, and when I have enough time, research time, I'm going to try and unpick it. Now, the Kotkill episode is discussed in some depth by the Swedish scholar Katarina Raudvere in her chapter on Trölldomur, magic in medieval Iceland. And she makes the point that the emphasis on their foreign origin very clearly marks them out as other. The Hebrideans are being treated in a very similar way to the Sami people of Scandinavia, who were regarded as magical and uncanny by the Norse, and were still regarded in this way in Norwegian folklore until very recently. Other, the Hebrideans may have been, but we need to bear in mind that they're generally given Norse names, particularly those Hebrideans who are textually situated in Iceland, suggesting their otherness was mitigated to some degree. From the Icelandic perspective, Hebrideans seem to be regarded as a bit like us, but also rather strange. A typical example is the Hebridean called Svartur in Vatnsdæla saga. He seems to have been a rather off-putting kind of fellow, and he's described as mikill og sterkur og vinsæll og lít við alþýðuskap, big and strong, unpopular and contrary. The name Svartur means black, presumably black-haired, and it's a name that's often borne by slaves in other contexts. And Svartur turns out to be a hired killer. He's described as having a grim look, and he's willing to undertake revenge killings because, he says, he had experience of places where not everyone saw things the same way. He also said that it was more than likely that he would succeed on the errand, that's the killing, because he had been on raiding trips and often been the only one to escape. He lived up to his word, killing Guðbrandur Thorsteinsson in a very unheroic manner, stabbing him with a spear when he wasn't looking. This is just the sort of behaviour expected in the sagas of a violent, untrustworthy Hebridean. Burnt Njal saga, arguably the greatest Icelandic saga, which if you haven't read, I would heartily recommend. You must read it. It provides us with the dangerous figure of Þjóstólfur, whose very name tells us what sort of person he was. So he is a Hebridean, and his name includes the noun Þjóstur, which means anger, fury, or violence. And as the psychopathic foster father of the femme fatale Hallgerður, who's one of the leading figures in the saga, he has an important role to play in the story. The saga says, Þjóstólfur was Hallgerð's foster father, a Hebridean by descent. He was strong and skilled in arms. He had killed many men and paid compensation for none of them. So that's not very honourable, but he's a great killer, you see. It was said that he did little to temper Hallgerð's character. For those who haven't read Njal saga, Þjóstólfur kills Hallgerð's first two husbands after they fall out with her. Her first husband, Thorvaldur, has to be said, she's a rather difficult character to get on with in the saga. Anyway, she falls out with her first husband, Thorvaldur, and he strikes her, and this draws blood. Now, Þjóstólfur seeks revenge for this, and he pursues Thorvaldur in a 6-oared boat, which he rows himself for 25 miles out to the Bjarnareyjar, the little islands in Breiðafjörður off the west coast of Iceland. And after throwing insults, Þjóstólfur then hacks Thorvaldur down with his massive iron-bound axe. Hallgerð's second husband, Glumur, also falls out with her. They have an argument about Þjóstólfur's quarrelsome nature. And despite being told by Hallgerður not to avenge a small slap that she received from Glumur, because she really loves her second husband, Þjóstólfur heads off with a grin on his face to do the evil deed. And after trading insults again, Þjóstólfur kills Glumur, making it a brace of husbands. Þjóstólfur is the quintessential Hebridean in the sagas. Strong, aggressive, dishonourable, but likes to get involved in fights. In another saga, Eyrbyggja saga, there are two notable Hebrideans. The first one is Ulfgeir, who's the captain of a group of Hebrideans who owned half a share in a trading vessel. And the other one is Thorgunna, who I mentioned before. Thorgunna hin Suðureyska, Thorgunna the Hebridean, who's described as a big, rich Hebridean woman, who causes the hauntings at Froðau, which is the farm where she's come to stay. It's very likely that this is the same Thorgunna who I mentioned earlier was the lover of Leif Erikson, and this is her on her way to try and catch up with Leif. Uncharacteristically, Ulfgeir is a decent chap and makes a good account of himself in a fight. So it's good to see that the occasional Hebridean escapes stereotyping, but that's definitely not the case with Thorgunna. Interestingly, Ulfgeir has a companion with him called Nagli, who turns out to be a snivelling coward and is described as a mikill maður of fótfatur, a big man and a speedy runner. And he is described as being Scottish. So they're making a distinction between Hebridean and Scottish. Anyway, Nagli conforms to another stereotype, that of the fast-running Scot. According to Eric's saga, two of these fast-running Scots, Haki and Hekia, accompanied Thorfinn Karlsefni on his exploration of Vinland, and they were said to be fleeter of foot than any deer. And they were wearing an unusual armless hooded cloak, which was called a kjafak, from Old Irish cochel, which was ideal for long-distance running. And here we have a picture from a Pictish stone of a Pict wearing a kjafak or cochel. I don't know if Scots are particularly fast runners nowadays, but that's how they were viewed in the sagas. Anyway, back to this Hebridean Thorgunna. She is a very awkward character. The saga says she was hard to get on with and wasted little time in conversation. She was also very protective of her belongings, even her rake, which she refused to sell, which she refused to give to anyone. And she also refused to sell her beautiful bed sheets and bed curtains to the farmer's wife, Thuridr, in whose house she was staying at Froðau, which wasn't very nice of her, has to be said. Now, that summer, Thorgunna and the workers at Froðau farm were drying hay when a black cloud of heavy rain suddenly fell upon them. After the black cloud had disappeared, they were shocked to discover that the cloud had rained blood. And later on that day, they were able to dry the hay, all except for Thorgunna, who her hay remained wet. And soon Thorgunna fell ill. She instructed that she was soon to die, and that when she did die, her bed furnishings were to be destroyed because they would be of no one. They would do no one any good. So she wasn't wanting them to be passed on to the farmer's wife. And she's right. She does soon die. And of course, the furnishings aren't destroyed. And this causes a terrible disaster to befall Froðau. The people of Froðau farm begin to die in large numbers because of this influence of Thorgunna. She brings death in a different way from Þjóstólfur or Svartur. She doesn't kill them herself, but she brings death all the same because of her bed curtains. Now, like Kotgil's son Hallbjörn, Thorgunna also makes a post-death visitation. Although dead, she appears on one occasion to prepare a meal for those who are taking her corpse on the long trip to Skálholt for burial. And she's doubly frightening because, as well as being dead, and you don't really want to see dead people making you breakfast, she was also completely starkers. So that was doubly frightening. So that's two Revenant Hebridean zombies that we have met so far. If we return to Laxdæla saga, we find a third zombie. in the figure of Viga Hrapur, or Killer Hrap. There's a good name, Killer Hrap. A Viga mother is a fighting man, one ever at war, one who kills as many men as he can. And he's described in the saga as a big, strong man who would never yield to anyone. So Mikil mother of Varhan of Sterkur. So another, he's big and he's strong. Okay, he would never yield to anyone, whatever the opposition. And because he was so overbearing, as has just been written, and refused to pay compensation for his misdeeds, he fled to Iceland and bought land he was now farming. He wasn't a very nice neighbour to have. Hrap did not endear himself to most people. He was aggressive towards his neighbours and let them know he would make life difficult for them if they regarded anyone as being superior to him. In other words, he was typically unpleasant. Okay, and indeed the saga tells us he became more and more brutal. He molested his neighbours so relentlessly that they could scarcely hold their own against him. Eventually, old age sort of worked its magic on him, and he foresaw his own death. And he told his wife Vigdis that when he died, he wanted to be buried standing up in the doorway of his house, so that he could keep an eye on his dwelling. And this all duly came to pass. And as the saga says, as difficult as he had been to deal with during his life, he was now very much worse when he was dead, for he walked again a great deal after he was dead. People say that he murdered most of his servants in hauntings, and he caused a great deal of trouble to those who lived near, and the house of Hrapstead became deserted. Okay, so he's what they call in Old Norse a draugur, a dead person walking, okay, a zombie, rather than a sort of intangible, ghostly figure. This is a big, bloated beast that comes and kills people. Now, the story of Hrap's upright burial brings to mind the story in the Irish 12th century manuscript, the Leabhar na Húdare, the book of the Dun Cow, about King Lugaire, who supposedly ruled at Tara on the arrival of St. Patrick in 432 AD. Now, Lugaire was buried in or Leary, this was in modern form, was buried in a standing position in the outer rampart of his fortress, fully armed, and with his face turned southward towards his enemies, the Leinstermen. And what we seem to have here, again, is a story about a Hebridean, the story of Hrap, that's connected to Old Irish legendary material. So he is taking the role of Lugaire, of Leary. He's being buried standing up. It's not a normal motif that you find in other stories in the sagas, specifically with this Hebridean. Now, until Hrap's undead, undecayed corpse is finally burnt by Olafur Huskilsson the Peacock, things don't go well at Hrap's farm. His continued presence is deadly to anyone wanting to take it over. His son and heir, Sumarlevi, goes mad and dies, and it's surely no coincidence that he bears the name Sumarlevi, which has such Hebridean connotations and connections. And his brother-in-law, that's the modern Gaelic name, Sorlia, and his brother-in-law, Thorstein, and family, having taken over the farm, are all drowned. So anyone who tries to take over Hrap's farm ends up dead. Now, the drowning of Thorstein and family seems to have been caused by a large seal with huge flippers, whose eyes everyone thought were those of a human. And presumably this was Hrap in the form of a seal, which would make this one of the earliest examples of the Selkie myth complex. Now, the otherness of the Hebrideans in the Norse context is the focus of a new piece of research which looks at questions of insular ethnicity in the Norse period. It's Howarth's 2017 University of Oslo MA thesis, Fierce, Barbarous, Unbiddable Perceptions of Norse-Gael Identity in Orkney Caithness, Kirka 1000 to 1400, rather long title. Now, although this thesis is focused mainly on Orkney and Caithness, he does look at the Hebrides. And his main argument is that these communities had mixed ethnic identities, both Norse and Gaelic, and as such were a bit suspect as far as Icelanders were concerned. And it's undoubtedly true that by the 13th century, when the sagas were being written, Gaelic culture and language were very much part of the mixed ethnic makeup of the Hebrideans. And indeed, Gaelic might well have been the dominant language in the Isles by that time. From the Icelandic perspective, it seems that the more Gaelic a mixed Norse-Gaelic community might be, the more untrustworthy, unsavoury and downright dangerous it was. For example, the Shetlanders, with no Gaelic component, seem to have been regarded as essentially no different from the Icelanders. So you can sort of compare how Shetlanders are written about with Hebrideans. So there's quite a lot to be said for this idea. However, again, it's worth noting that none of the Hebridean stock characters actually have Gaelic names. There's nothing obviously Gaelic about them except the stories that are told about them, such as being buried, standing up, and blighting the land with the evil eye. This suggests that the Icelanders knew the sort of tales to tell about people with Gaelic heritage, which I think is rather amazing. The Icelanders were not alone in this stereotyping, and I wonder if the Icelanders might have been influenced by the image of the Gael in Anglo-Norman sources. For example, in the Gesta Annalia, there's an account of the Scottish King William the Lion's invasion of England in 1173. He went, we are told, with the Highland Scots, i.e. the Gaels, whom they called brutes, and the Galwegians, who knew not how to spare either place or person, but raged after the manner of beasts. Now, the Galwegians were the Gaelic-speaking people of Galloway. The original form of their name was Galgaeliv, which can be interpreted as Norse Gael, and their likely origin was amongst the mixed Gaelic and Norse population in the Inner Hebrides, and they were noted for their particular brutality, which included, according to Henry of Huntingdon, a 12th century Anglo-Norman writer, the good old Viking custom of tossing children on spear points. So the Anglo-Normans had this sort of image of Gaels and Hebrideans, which might have influenced the way Icelanders wrote about them, because there was contact between Iceland and England. However, even if Icelanders were not aware of the Anglo-Norman perspective towards the Gael, they would have been aware that the Hebrides were an arena for many violent events during the 12th and 13th centuries, and they would have known that Hebridean society was a warlike one. Hebrideans were regularly involved in the warlike struggles to control the city of Dublin. For example, in 1142, Otter, the son of Otterson, the Lucht Inchigal, of the people of the Hebrides, or the men of the Hebrides, took the headship and supremacy of Dublin. Hebrideans were intimately involved in the internecine struggles to control Dublin. And from at least the mid-13th century, Hebrideans were supplying mercenary forces to native Irish kings. In 1259, Eido Conchover, king of Connacht, received a dowry of 160 Hebridean warriors from the daughter of Dougal Machrúri, the king of the Hebrides. These mercenaries were known later as the Galoglich, or Gallowglasses. So, at the same time as the sagas were being written, there were Hebridean warriors out and about doing daring deeds that would have been, these stories would have been transmitted to Iceland. If you want a description of what the Galoglich were like, we have an English description from quite late on, from around 1600, and it sits quite well with the earlier saga stereotype. The Galoglich are described as picked and selected men of great and mighty bodies, cruel without compassion. Okay, so therefore, I think Icelandic awareness in the 13th century, when they were writing the sagas, their awareness of the Hebrides and the Hebrideans, at that point, coloured their stories about Hebrideans who visited Iceland in previous centuries. And the Hebrideans were clearly, definitely more warlike than the Icelanders in the 13th century. They would have been known and renowned for that. Now, it seems that the Hebridean stereotype, which existed in Iceland, also existed in other Norse-speaking areas of the North Atlantic. In later tradition, Hebrideans, often known as Lewismen, had a bad reputation in Orkney, Shetland, and even in the Faroe Islands. And they were supposed to have raided Fulla, amongst other places, and cut down all the trees. And when in 1460, John MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, unleashed his forces on Orkney, and possibly Shetland as well, the Hebridean stereotype was confirmed. Now, this was a letter that was sent by the Bishop of Orkney to the King of Denmark, complaining about what happened. And he said, the foresaid Caterans and men of the Hebrides and Ireland and others in the foresaid month of June entered in great numbers with their fleets and boats in warlike manner, and the said earldom of Orkney, and burned your lands, towns, houses, and buildings to the ground, and most cruelly destroyed your people of both sexes and all ages with the sword, and carried away with them their goods, animals, plenishings, jewels, money, and everything they could for their own use, leaving little or nothing unless the burnt soil of the empty ground the ground empty and useless. So, yeah, from the Orcadian perspective, at least in 1460, they're not getting a good press. So, I said at the beginning, in a sense, Hebrideans in the saga represent death. When a Hebridean character makes an appearance, you know someone is going to die, and probably they're going to die horribly. We're rounding things off now. So I've given you this image of this stereotype. And of course, I am not claiming, before anyone gets annoyed, that the Hebrideans were like their stereotype necessarily. But from the Icelandic perspective, this is how they were described. And it says more, I think, about the Icelanders rather than the Hebrideans. Okay. So to finish, I'd like to give a Hebridean the last word. In 1119, there was a wedding held in Iceland, and for entertainment, the guests were regaled with the saga of Ormur Barrearskald, okay, managed to get my tongue around that, who seems to have lived in the 10th century. That's Ormur, the poet from Bara. Now, what we would give to have the saga of Ormur Barrearskald. Unfortunately, we don't know whether Ormur conformed to the typical Hebridean stereotype because, would you believe it, his saga has been lost. However, fragments of one of his poems have survived, and this one is a reference to the sea which took Hebrideans to Iceland and even to Greenland. And this is it. Utan gnir á eyri, Ymi's blóð fara góðra. Out on the sandbank of good vessels, Ymir's blood roars. Ymir was the giant that the Odin and his brothers killed to create the world, the sea, and the sky, and his blood is used as a kenning or a synonym for the ocean. So I think with that, there's plenty to think about. Hebrideans as unruly characters, but also as zombies, and fitting for the run-up to Halloween. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was brilliant. We've got some time for some questions. If anyone would like to add anything into the chat or to raise their hand, we can do that just now. Oh. Brian Witters, we've got you. Would you like to ask a question? If you unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yes,
you are indeed, yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there any tales of the Icelandic saga that make reference to second sight?
Yes, there are, I can't think of the exact examples at the moment. But yes, the ability to foretell, to see what's going to happen next, or to foretell somebody's death. There is reference to that, yeah, but not necessarily with Hebrideans, but more generally as a magical power that some people have. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Would anyone else like to ask any more questions? Okay, Taylor, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick kind of technical question, actually. I was wondering if a list of all the sagas with Hebrideans mentioned exists or could be provided.
It doesn't exist yet. It's one of these things that needs to be done. So the Hebrideans that I mentioned in the lecture, I've collected myself from the sagas, but with a little bit more work, there would be more added to the list.
Great. Thank you.
Gwen, do you have your hand up?
Yes. Is there any evidence that Hebrideans went further into Europe, or perhaps even on the Crusades, as some of the Vikings did?
Yes, they did. There, in the 12th century, there were Hebrideans involved in the Crusades. There's been quite a lot of work done on that, but I can't remember the details at the moment. But there definitely were Hebrideans on Crusade, along with people from Orkney as well. There's a far more well-known crusade led by the Jarl of Orkney, Rögnvaldur, in the 1130s, 1140s. But there were Hebrideans too.
Nope. We've got some questions in the chat. Let me just get them up. Jill was asking, are there any references to the West Coast mainland, Argyll? I host a local archive just north of Oban, and we have glimmers of Norse heritage and always interested in more connections.
Well, there are quite a number of Norse place names along the West Coast, on the littoral. And I've looked at Norse place names in Argyll, and there are more than one might expect, particularly in a place like Kintyre. There's a large number of place names, particularly Dale place names, Dalir, which seem to have been early settlements. And one of the names for Argyll in Old Norse was Dalir, meaning the Dales. And in one of the references to Orkneyinga Saga, one of the references in Orkneyinga Saga to Somerled, the great Somerled, the ruler of the Hebrides, it says that he and his family lived in Dalir, in the Dales. So there's a lot still to be uncovered in Argyll and the southwest Hebrides from the Norse period.
Is there any more questions? Any more hands up? Oh, we've got another question come through. Okay, so Angus is asking, hold on if I can get rid of the notifications. Where do you stand on the debate on whether the existing populations were decimated?
Well, my PhD thesis was argued that there was a different situation in different parts of the Hebrides. So, say in the Inner Hebrides, there's evidence for the survival of pre-Norse place names, so therefore the pre-Norse population. But in the Outer Hebrides, particularly in Lewis, there's no clear evidence of any survival of pre-Norse place names, suggesting something totally devastating happened to the pre-existing population.
And Suzanne is asking, what were the books that you mentioned earlier?
Okay, well, basically it depends which books. There's quite a few. The sagas themselves are easy to get hold of. So Njál Saga, Hebrideans Saga, and Laxdæla Saga. You can buy paperback copies of those very cheaply on Amazon. But there's the book, The Vikings in Lewis, which is a nice little handy book to get hold of. Just hang on a second. Read the title again. Well, the title is Vikings in Lewis, but it's Brittany Shorn and Judy Quinn.
A related question, Liam's asking, are there distinctions made in the sagas between Scottish Gaels and Irish Gaels, or Scottish Gaels and Picts? I'm thinking of the term vestman or indeed papper. Any idea which church they might have belonged to?
Yeah, well, it's quite a long answer would be needed to explain all the different ethnic distinctions. Well, in the sagas, they talk about Irsk, meaning Irish. They talk about, or Irar, rather, that's the adjective. So Irar are the Irish, Skotar are the Scots, Suðuríar are the Hebrideans. So they seem to regard them as all, the Norse regarded them as slightly different, or at least coming from different places. But they did have a word for Pict as well, Petar, and they don't turn up much in the sagas, has to be said. But there seems to be an awareness of them in Norse tradition, because there are a number of place names in Orkney and Shetland which are in origin Petar, so the places of the Picts. And in fact, there's a couple of place names in Iceland which take their name from the Picts as well, although it's difficult to explain how that might have been the case. And I'm not sure what the rest of that question was, but the Papar, the Papar, yeah. What church? Well, there's been lots of debate about that. Personally, it's just, to me, it's the insular church. I wouldn't draw a distinction between the Pictish church or the Gaelic church, because the church in Pictland was predominantly run and organised by Gaelic speakers. So it's difficult to sort of make a distinction there. But when you find Papar place names in the Outer Hebrides, Orkney and Shetland, you're finding reference to the insular church. So not the Norwegian church as such, but the insular church with links to the mainland of Scotland and Ireland. But are these names that predate the arrival of the Norse? Are they names to show that there existed churches before the Norse arrived, or are they evidence for missionary activity from the insular church into the Isles once a Norse population had established itself? Well, we don't really know, but the word itself in Norse, it's borrowed from, well, the saga says borrowed from German, but it could easily have been borrowed from Gaelic as well. Just means, and ultimately from Latin, means father. So that's a form of respect to the priest, as it were.
We've got one more question in the chat. This is from Jill. As a small farmer, I am also interested in the Norse agricultural influence in the West Coast. Is there any reference to the more peaceful activities in the sagas?
Well, there is. When they're talking about Iceland, there's lots of information about farming and bringing in the hay and looking after the cattle and the general everyday life on the farm. But as far as the Hebrides go, we don't have any saga based in the Hebrides. But if you want to find out how the Norse ran and maintained their farms, then the best thing to do is to read some sagas.
Gwen, I think you had your hand up again. Do you want to ask another question before we have one more? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes. What was the relative timeline of the stone circles on the Outer Hebrides in relation to stone circles in Orkney, for example? Brogar, Callanish.
Well, pretty much the same era, but many thousands of years before the Vikings. So,
Thank you.
We've got two more in the chat. What was the book that you mentioned about magic in Iceland that references the Hebrideans?
oh yes, that's right. That's Trolldomur in Iceland. That is, 1 second. Katarina Raudvere. Where's it gone? Oops. Anyway, it's Katarina Raudvere, Trolldomur in Iceland, and Trolldomur is the word for magic. Can't seem to find it. Oh yes, there we go. Yeah, Katarina Raudvere, Raudvere.
Great. Callum's asking, what was the name you had for the old Gaelic Hebridean gods?
The Tuatha Dé Danann, or the Tuatha, they would have pronounced the TH at the time. Tuatha Dé Danann. Tuatha, a new word, DE, a new word, DANANN. So the tribe of the goddess Danu.
So the other, Taylor, did you have your hand up again?
Sorry, no, I don't think so.
Okay, that's fine.
But actually, can I just be really annoying and ask him to spell that last name one more time?
We will make some notes, Andrew, and we can send them round to the people that are online.
Okay, but it's Tuatha, Tuatha, or Tuatha, DE, and then the next word, DANANN, Danann. Tuatha Dé Danann. Easy enough to find on Google. And,
Great, thank you so much.
Well, that's it at 8 o'clock. So unless there's any more questions, I'd like to, we've had one more come in from Alex, and it is, was there a specific term for the zombie?
there is Draugr. 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 That'll give you nightmares if you read up about them.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. That's been brilliant night, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and also to Andrew for his interesting talk. I really hope you all enjoyed it, and
So do I.
We've got another talk coming up this Thursday, but this will be delivered in Gaelic, and it's by Roddy McLean, who will be teaching us all how to identify and use seaweed in Gaelic. So I'm really looking forward to that. So if you're interested in that, then please look at our Facebook page to find out more details on how to sign up. It's similar to what we're doing tonight, but I'm realising that we can only seem to get 56 people online at the same time. So we may need to stream that talk on YouTube as well. So, but yes, this is recorded and will be available on YouTube from tomorrow. So thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.